In 1862, newlyweds Joseph and Mary Jane Merrick welcomed a beautiful baby boy. But 5 years later, their child's appearance began to change radically. Mysterious lumps started to appear on his body, whilst sections of his skin began to thicken and become loose. Eventually, these changes would lead to their child becoming known as the Elephant Man of Victorian England. Born on August the 5th, 1862 in Leicester, England, Joseph Carey Merrick was named after his father, who worked as a warehouseman, and the preacher William Carey. His mother, Mary Jane, suffered from a physical disability but found work as a domestic servant. At his birth, Joseph was a healthy baby boy who exhibited no signs of an anatomical disorder. His parents would go on to have 3 children together, all suffering tragic fates. Joseph's brother, William Arthur, died of scarlet fever age 4, while his sister, Marian Eliza, was born physically disabled and would pass away at 23 years old from myelitis, an inflammation of the spinal cord. Reports differ on when Joseph began to first display signs of his condition. Some state that he developed a swelling on his lips along with a bony lump on his forehead around 21 months old, whereas a pamphlet published in 1884 states he was 5 when he began developing abnormal growths on his forehead and at the back of his neck, and that several of his body parts also began to swell, so much so that the colour of his skin turned a sickly grey hue. According to Encyclopaedia Britannica, quote, the size of his head increased to 3 feet in circumference, with spongy skin hanging from the back of his head and across his face. Deformation of the jaws rendered him incapable of showing facial expression or speaking clearly. Although his left arm was normal, his right arm ended in a wrist that was 12 inches in circumference and a fin-like hand. His legs were deformed in the same manner as his arm, and a defective hip caused such lameness that he could walk only with the aid of a stick. End quote. His parents believed that Merrick's condition resulted from his mother being knocked over by a fairground elephant when she was pregnant with him. This belief stemmed from the long since discredited medical theory which posited that if a pregnant woman were to develop a sudden fear of an animal or object, their child would bear some form of mark from it. Aside from his deformities, Joseph suffered a fall during his childhood, damaging his hip. The injury would become infected, leaving him requiring a cane to aid with walking. This added to his struggles. However, his mother, whom he was close to, remained positive, encouraging him to live his life as normally as possible. Unfortunately, Mary Jane died when Merrick was 11 after contracting bronchial pneumonia. A year later, his father remarried a local widow named Emma Wood Antill. The pair would make his life miserable. Joseph Sr. and his 2 children moved in with Emma, who had her own offspring. In this full house, money was an issue, and Joseph Jr. would find himself regularly being taunted and sneered at. This led him to stay out of the house for long periods and miss meals, as those he would have at home would be followed by the snide remark, "That's more than you have earned." Joseph left school aged 13 and found work rolling cigars in an effort to abate his stepmother's constant jibes. He did this for several years until the deformity in his right hand progressed to a point where he no longer possessed the necessary dexterity to complete the task. Despite his difficulties, Joseph was still keen to work, if for nothing else than to keep his stepmother from taunting him further. His father was eventually able to secure him a license to sell items door to door, but this endeavour did not go well. Joseph's facial deformities meant he found it difficult to speak clearly and make himself understood. He also found himself met with shocked and horrified faces by the few people who answered the door to him. Some would even follow him out of curiosity. Unable to support himself financially, home life grew ever more depressive until one day Joseph Sr. severely beat his son before throwing him out onto the street. Merrick would live with his uncle Charles for a time until, at the age of 17, and with nowhere else to go, he ended up at the Leicester Union Workhouse. This facility was built in 1839 with the aim of helping the city's poor. However, the conditions inside were incredibly harsh. Despite leaving briefly several weeks later, Joseph would ultimately spend 4 years in the workhouse. He even underwent surgery there, having part of the growth on his mouth removed after it grew to 20 centimeters. With his efforts to find employment away from the workhouse failing at every turn, Merrick eventually came to the conclusion that the only way to escape the workhouse was to exploit his deformities. In 1883, he wrote to a freak show proprietor named Sam Torr, who agreed to hire him as a travelling exhibit. Freak shows were incredibly popular during the 18th and 19th centuries, with Queen Victoria herself reportedly being a big fan of them. According to the website History Today, quote, because they were often touring shows visiting large cities and small villages alike, they attracted thousands of people each year. This was helped by the low entry fee, with some charging only a penny for admittance. They were also accessible. You did not need to be highly educated to enjoy the freak show. They appealed to every class and to adults as well as children. End quote. Merrick toured Leicester, Nottingham and London. Along the way, he gained the moniker of the Elephant Man and was said to be half a man, half an elephant. In London, Joseph was hired by a shop owner named Tom Norman, who used human oddities to drum up business. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce Mr. Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. Before doing so, I ask you, please, to prepare yourselves. Brace yourselves up to witness one who is probably the most remarkable human being ever to draw the breath of life. It was while he was here that Merrick's unusual sleeping position was first noticed. Rather than lying on a bed, he slept sitting upright, with his legs drawn up and used as a headrest. Norman eventually realized that this was because Merrick's head was so large and heavy that it could crush his neck if he laid down. His show was moderately successful, and Joseph set aside his earnings in the hopes of buying a house someday. He was said to be an excellent writer and had written a short autobiography that was sold to audiences at the show. He also loved poetry and often ended his letters with a poem adapted from False Greatness by Isaac Watts, which goes, quote, "'Tis true my form is something odd, but blaming me is blaming God. Could I create myself anew, I would not fail in pleasing you. If I could reach from pole to pole, or grasp the ocean with a span, I would be measured by the soul. The mind's the standard of the man." End quote. It was at Norman's shop that Merrick first encountered Dr. Frederick Treves, a physician who worked at London Hospital, which was located nearby. He would later write, quote, "His head was the most interesting thing. It was very, very big, like an enormous bag with a lot of books in it." End quote. Treves asked a colleague named Reg Tuckett to return to Tom Norman's shop and inquire about the possibility of Joseph visiting the London hospital to be studied. Joseph agreed, and in order to not draw a crowd, he donned a cloak, along with a cap encompassing a Hessian sack to cover his face. Fascinated by Merrick's deformities, Dr. Treves took extensive notes and measurements of his various body parts and growths across several visits. He recorded that Joseph had a head circumference of 36 inches and was covered in warty growths with some areas of skin hanging away from the body. Merrick hated the treatment he received and eventually refused to return, stating that he, quote, felt like an animal in a cattle market. Despite his protestations, this would not be the last Joseph Merrick would see of the London hospital. At this time in Victorian Britain, attitudes towards so-called freak shows were changing. The large crowds they drew were seen as a nuisance and their subjects an affront to public decency. With authorities cracking down on such events, Joseph's managers made the decision to send him on tour across Europe in 1885. Things didn't get much better on the continent. They too were cracking down on such shows, and while in Brussels, things would take a turn for the worse when Joseph was deserted by his manager. He had also made off with Merrick's life savings of £50, equivalent to roughly £6,300 today. Joseph struggled to make his way back to London, but eventually made his way from Antwerp to Essex in 1886. From there, he made his way to Liverpool Street Station on June the 24th, but had no place to stay. His appearance soon began to draw a crowd, however, until a policeman was able to move him away from them. He struggled to explain himself to the policeman and instead showed him a calling card given to him by Dr. Treves. Treves was contacted and quickly whisked Joseph back to the London hospital. After examining 24-year-old Merrick, Dr. Treves concluded that he was suffering from a debilitating heart condition that would kill him in a few years. This drew the sympathy of the hospital committee, who agreed to house Merrick, but they lacked the funds to care for him long term. The hospital's chairman, Francis Carr Gom, had a letter published in the Times explaining Joseph's situation and asking for suggestions on what to do next. The public put forward many ideas, but perhaps more importantly, many donors came forward willing to help fund his stay. In the basement of London Hospital, 2 adjacent rooms were adapted for Merrick. As per his request, it had direct access to the courtyard and contained no mirrors because he hated being reminded of his appearance. There, he led a quiet yet happy life, enjoying daily visits from Dr. Treves, with whom he gradually became close as he eventually began to understand Joseph's speech. According to the website, all that's interesting, quote, Dr. Treves became used to his speech impediment, though he'd originally assumed that the Elephant Man was an imbecile. He came to find Merrick's intellect completely normal. Though Merrick was wholly aware of the unfairness that filled his existence, he bore little ill will towards the world that had shrunk away from him in disgust. End quote. At this point, the only positive relationship Joseph had had with a woman had been the one with his mother. The workhouse had been segregated, and those he met as part of the freak show recoiled in fear. In an effort to help him feel normal, Dr. Treves decided it would be a good idea to introduce Joseph to his friend, a young widow named Leila Maturin. She had been told of Merrick's appearance and agreed to the introduction. The meeting was short but positive. It's said that Joseph quickly became overcome with emotion, stating that Leila was the first woman to smile at him and shake his hand. The pair would stay in touch for the rest of Joseph's life. Dr. Treves believed that he wished to eventually live in a hospital for the blind, where he might one day meet a woman who would not flinch at his visage. Other prominent figures visited Merrick, including Princess Alexandra of Wales, who eventually became Queen Consort of King Edward VII of Great Britain. During her visit, she shook his hand and even gifted him a signed photograph of herself, which he treasured. From then on, she sent him a card on Christmas Day each year. Others in high society would visit Merrick and bring him gifts. In return, he would give them baskets and card models. he had made himself. The hospital staff tried their best to meet Merrick's wishes. They also fulfilled his desire to visit the theatre. Dr. Treves, with the help of a renowned British actor, Madge Kendall, arranged a special viewing for him at the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, which, at the time, was holding its annual Christmas pantomime. Merrick was given a seat in a private box that belonged to Baroness Burdett Coote, which lay partially concealed from the audience. Later, Dr. Treves would say that the performance left Merrick awed, enthralled and speechless. He continued to talk about it long after it ended, reliving its story as if it had been real. This trip to the theatre wasn't the only excursion that Dr. Treves planned. According to the website People Pill, quote, "On 3 occasions, Merrick left the hospital and London on holiday, spending a few weeks at a time in the countryside. Through elaborate arrangements that allowed him to board a train unseen and to have an entire carriage to himself, he travelled to Northamptonshire to stay at Fawsley Hall, the estate of Lady Knightley. He stayed at the gamekeeper's cottage and spent the days walking in the estate's woods, collecting wildflowers. He befriended a young farm labourer who later recalled Merrick as an interesting and well-educated man." End quote. Unfortunately, these excursions ended when Merrick's deteriorating health left him bedridden and with diminishing energy. However, his physical deformities continued to grow, his head becoming even larger. On April the 11th, 1890, after 4 years at London Hospital, 27-year-old Joseph Merrick was found dead in his bed. An autopsy later revealed that he had a dislocated neck. As his head grew, Joseph adopted the sleeping position mentioned earlier, sleeping sat up with his head resting on his knees. Dr. Treves stated that he had often mentioned his desire to sleep lying down, like other people. He must, with some determination, have made the experiment. This led to the weight of his head crushing his windpipe, causing him to asphyxiate. However, some historians now believe that his spinal cord was either crushed or severed when his enlarged head fell back onto the bed. After his death, Merrick's body was dissected by Dr. Treves, who took skin samples from him as well as plaster casts of his head and limbs. His skeleton was also preserved and kept at the London Hospital, along with a mounted replica. Musician Michael Jackson reportedly tried to purchase the real skeleton, but was refused by the hospital committee as they believed doing so would be disrespectful to Merrick. Merrick and his family believed that his deformities were the result of his mother almost being crushed underfoot by an elephant. However, many now believe that he may have been suffering from a severe case of neurofibromatosis, which is a genetic disorder that forms numerous tumours on the nerve tissue. He could have also had Proteus syndrome, a rare disease that is characterised by the overgrowth of various tissues in the body, including bone and skin. It was initially assumed that Merrick was never buried, since all his flesh was reportedly preserved by Dr. Treves and later studied by medical students. However, this was proven false in May 2019 when his biographer Joanne Vigo Mungovin discovered that some of his soft remains had actually been laid to rest in a common grave at the City of London cemetery. Her discovery reignited calls to give the rest of Joseph Merrick's remains a Christian burial. He was devout and deeply religious, which is why many believe that that would have been what he wanted. But so far, the Royal London Hospital has refused to release Merrick's skeleton. Joseph Merrick led a short and tragic life. Cast out onto the streets by his own father, stared at in either disgust or horror, and exploited as a freak show exhibit. Fortunately, his final years appear to have held some happiness for him, cared for by doctors and nurses who stopped at nothing to give him everything he wished for. Merrick may have been shunned for nearly all his life, but his strange and tragic story means the world will never forget him. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story that will make you say, "Well, I never."